The glider came apart in the air. Obergefreiter Klaus Dietrich watched from his machine gun position in the hedgerow as the fabric and wood craft disintegrated 300 meters above the Norman countryside, its wings folding like paper in a child's fist. Men tumbled out, their bodies tiny and dark against the pre-dawn sky of June 6, 1944. One parachute opened, then another. Most did not have time. Dietrich turned to his gunner, Werner Stolz, and allowed himself a brief, grim smile. Holzkisten, he muttered. Wooden boxes. That's what the intelligence briefings had called the British and American gliders. Disposable coffins that the Allies were using because they were too desperate, too stretched thin to land proper forces. The Luftwaffe liaison officer who had visited their position 3 weeks earlier had been explicit. The enemy gliders represented a last resort tactic, a sign that the Anglo-Americans lacked the air transport and proper doctrine for coordinated assault. They would crash more often than land. They carried no heavy equipment. The troops inside, if they survived the landing at all, would be scattered, disoriented, easy targets. But then the second glider landed. It came down hard in the field beyond the stone wall, crushing the wheat beneath it, the nose plowing a furrow in the dark earth. Dietrich expected it to crumple, to cartwheel, to break its back the way the first one had. Instead, it skidded to a halt, upright and intact. The side door flew open before the glider had even stopped moving. Men poured out, not scattered stragglers, not disoriented survivors stumbling from a wreck. 12 soldiers in full combat gear, moving with rehearsed precision, forming a defensive perimeter in seconds. One carried what looked like a radio pack. Another had a mortar tube strapped to his back. They moved like a unit that had trained for this exact moment, and they moved toward Dietrich's position. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Dietrich's smile disappeared. He pressed his eye to the MG-42's sight and prepared to fire, but movement in his peripheral vision made him hesitate. 3 more gliders were landing in the adjacent fields, their massive black shapes descending in the half-light like prehistoric birds. Then 6 more beyond those, then a dozen more on the horizon, coming down in loose formations that seemed almost coordinated despite the pre-dawn darkness and the ground fire now beginning to crack across the valley. The sky was full of them. The doctrine Dietrich had been taught, the intelligence assessments he had heard repeated in briefings since April, the contemptuous dismissal of Allied glider tactics as primitive and desperate. All of it was being rewritten in real time as he watched the largest airborne assault in military history unfold before his eyes. By the time the sun rose over Normandy on that June morning, more than 13,000 Allied paratroopers and glider troops would be on the ground behind German defensive lines, delivered by over 800 gliders that the Wehrmacht had been told would mostly crash or scatter their loads uselessly across the countryside. The German High Command had made a catastrophic miscalculation, one rooted in their own experiences with airborne assault and a fundamental misunderstanding of Allied industrial capacity and tactical innovation. The disaster at Crete in 1941, where German paratroopers had suffered horrific casualties despite ultimate victory, had convinced Hitler and the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht that large-scale airborne operations were inherently suicidal, that gliders in particular were too fragile and imprecise to deliver combat-effective forces. When intelligence reports began arriving in early 1944 suggesting that the Allies were mass-producing gliders and training thousands of troops for airborne assault, the German response had been skepticism, bordering on mockery. How wrong they were. The story of that miscalculation and the German soldiers who experienced the shock of reality when those suicide missions landed intact behind their lines reveals something profound about the nature of the Second World War in its final years. it exposes the widening gap between German military doctrine, still rooted in early war victories and limited by shrinking resources, and Allied operational capability, built on a foundation of industrial production and tactical flexibility that the Wehrmacht could no longer match. More intimately, it shows how individual German soldiers, men like Dietrich, who had believed what they'd been told about enemy incompetence and desperation, confronted the evidence of their eyes and were forced to abandon comfortable assumptions in the space of a single morning. This is the story of how the German army learned to fear the glider, and what that fear revealed about a war that was already lost. To understand the depth of German miscalculation regarding Allied glider operations, we must first understand where their contempt came from. It was not baseless arrogance, but rather the product of their own painful experience with airborne warfare, and a logical, if ultimately flawed, extrapolation from that experience. The German attitude toward gliders in 1944 was shaped decisively by what had happened on Crete 3 years earlier. Operation Mercury, the airborne invasion of Crete in May of 1941, had been the largest German airborne operation of the war and, by traditional metrics, a success. German Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers, had seized the island from British and Commonwealth forces through sheer audacity and fighting skill. But the cost had been staggering. Of the approximately 22,000 German airborne troops committed to the operation, more than 6,000 became casualties in the first week alone. Some units suffered losses exceeding 40%. The 7th Air Division, the Wehrmacht's elite paratrooper formation, was effectively destroyed as a combat force. The gliders used in that operation, the DFS 230 and the massive Messerschmitt Me 321 Gigant, had proven particularly vulnerable. Many crashed on landing, killing, or injuring their passengers before they could even engage the enemy. Others landed too scattered to form cohesive units. The few that landed intact often found themselves isolated, their heavy equipment inaccessible or damaged, their crews cut off from support. Hitler himself was so shaken by the casualties that he reportedly told General Kurt Student, the architect of German airborne warfare, "Crete proved that the day of the paratrooper is over." The directive that followed was explicit. No more large-scale airborne operations. German paratroopers would henceforth be employed as elite infantry, not as airborne assault troops. Glider production was scaled back dramatically. The tactical doctrine for air-landed operations was effectively frozen, preserved in manuals but not developed further. While small-scale operations continued, most notably the daring rescue of Mussolini from Gran Sasso in September 1943, the German military had essentially abandoned the concept of mass airborne assault. This decision was reinforced by material reality. By 1943, the Luftwaffe was increasingly stretched thin, its transport aircraft desperately needed for supply operations on the Eastern Front and in the Mediterranean. The fuel, the pilots, the aircraft themselves. None could be spared for training large airborne formations or developing new glider designs. The industrial capacity that might have produced thousands of gliders was instead focused on fighters and tanks, on weapons for a defensive war that Germany now found itself fighting on multiple fronts. So when intelligence reports began arriving in late 1943 and early 1944, indicating that the Allies were doing exactly what Germany had abandoned, building massive glider fleets, training entire divisions for airborne operations, developing specialized equipment for air-landed assault, the German response was shaped by their own experience. They projected their own limitations onto the enemy. The intelligence assessments were remarkably consistent. A Wehrmacht intelligence summary from March 1944, recovered from German archives after the war, described Allied glider operations as limited in scope scope and effectiveness due to the inherent fragility of the aircraft and the difficulty of achieving concentrated landings. The report noted that American CG-4A Waco gliders were constructed primarily of wood and fabric, with minimal armor protection, and concluded that they would be highly vulnerable to ground fire and prone to structural failure
during landing. This assessment was not entirely wrong in its technical details. The Waco CG-4A was indeed built largely of wood and fabric. It did lack armor, and it was vulnerable to ground fire. But the intelligence analysis failed to grasp the crucial factors that made Allied glider operations fundamentally different from German experiences at Crete: the scale of production, the sophistication of the training, and most critically, the integration of glider operations into a comprehensive combined arms doctrine, supported by overwhelming air superiority. The numbers alone should have been alarming. By June of 1944, American factories had produced more than 13,000 Waco CG-4A gliders. British factories had built over 4,000 airspeed Horsa gliders, massive wooden aircraft capable of carrying 25 troops or a jeep and artillery piece. The production rate was staggering. At peak capacity, American manufacturers were completing 16 CG-4A gliders per day. This industrial output represented a commitment to airborne warfare that dwarfed anything Germany had attempted, even at the height of its power. But German intelligence either did not have access to accurate production figures or, more likely, could not conceptually process what those figures meant. The gulf between German and Allied industrial capacity had grown so wide by 1944 that German military planners often simply could not believe the numbers they were seeing. 1,000 gliders seemed plausible, if alarming. 10,000 gliders seemed like Allied propaganda or a gross intelligence error. The idea that the enemy might have the industrial capacity and organizational capability to actually use those gliders in coordinated mass operations was difficult to accept for officers whose own Luftwaffe was scrounging for every available transport aircraft. The training differential was equally significant, though harder for German intelligence to quantify. Allied airborne divisions, the American 82nd and 101st, the British 6th, had been training intensively for glider operations for more than 2 years. Pilots practiced formation flying and landing approaches until they could place gliders within meters of designated landing zones. Infantry practiced rapid exits from crashed or damaged gliders, rehearsing the transition from air to ground combat until it was instinctive. Entire mock operations were conducted, refining the coordination between tow aircraft and gliders, between different glider serials, between airborne and ground forces. This training was documented in captured Allied field manuals that German intelligence had access to, but the documents seem to have been read through the lens of German experience. The manuals described procedures for glider operations that were more systematic and detailed than anything in German doctrine. But German analysts apparently assumed this reflected inexperience, that the Allies needed detailed procedures because they lacked the combat veterans and tactical flexibility that German forces possessed. The alternative, that the Allies were developing a sophisticated new form of warfare that Germany had abandoned, was apparently too threatening to fully accept. There was also a psychological component to German dismissiveness. By 1944, the Wehrmacht's institutional identity was built around narratives of technical and tactical superiority. German soldiers were taught that they were better trained, better led, and more experienced than their enemies. Allied advantages in materiel were acknowledged, but framed as compensating for inferior fighting quality. The idea that the Allies might be innovating militarily, developing operational capabilities that Germany lacked, contradicted this self-conception.
It was psychologically easier to believe that Allied gliders were desperate measures than to accept that they represented a genuine tactical evolution. The attitude filtered down through the ranks in the form of dark humor and casual contempt. German soldiers stationed in France and the Low Countries in the spring of 1944 heard the intelligence briefings about potential Allied airborne operations and responded with gallows jokes. Holzkisten was the kindest term. Some called them Sarg transporter, coffin transports. Others made crude jokes about Allied troops being so afraid of fighting that they preferred to die in crashes before reaching the ground. Propaganda leaflets distributed to French coastal units featured cartoons of gliders disintegrating in midair, with captions suggesting that riding in one was tantamount to suicide. Oberst Friedrich von der Heydte, commander of the 6th Parachute Regiment and one of Germany's most experienced airborne officers, expressed a more nuanced but ultimately similar view in his post-war memoirs. He recalled receiving intelligence briefings in May of 1944 about the scale of Allied glider production and training, and his initial reaction was skepticism. We had learned at great cost on Crete that gliders were useful only in very specific circumstances, with overwhelming air superiority and against unprepared defenders, he wrote. The idea that the enemy would commit thousands of troops in such vulnerable aircraft seemed to confirm our assessment that they had more materiel than tactical sense. Von der Heydte's skepticism was shared across the German command structure. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, responsible for coastal defenses in France, mentioned gliders only briefly in his defensive planning. His primary concern was preventing an amphibious landing, and his famous Rommel's asparagus, the obstacles placed in potential glider landing zones throughout Normandy, were an afterthought, installed more to obstruct conventional aircraft than out of genuine concern about mass glider assault. Many of these obstacles were never
completed, their construction assigned low priority compared to beach defenses and tank barriers. The 7th Army, responsible for defending Normandy, issued defensive guidance in April of 1944 that mentioned airborne operations but devoted far more attention to amphibious assault scenarios. The guidance assumed that any airborne operations would be small-scale diversionary attacks, designed to create confusion but not capable of seizing and holding major objectives. Units were instructed to maintain mobile reserves to deal with paratrooper incursions, but the reserves were sized and positioned for dealing with battalion-strength raids, not division-level assaults. This miscalculation was not the result of incompetence. German intelligence officers and frontline commanders were working with incomplete information, filtered through their own institutional experience, and constrained by the material realities of their situation. They were making logical inferences from the data available to them, but logic built on false premises leads to false conclusions, and the premises underlying German assessments of Allied glider capability were fundamentally wrong. The Allies were not replicating German airborne doctrine with inferior resources. They were creating something new entirely. The key innovation was integration. Allied glider operations were never conceived as standalone attacks, but as components of larger combined arms operations. The gliders would land simultaneously with paratroopers, providing the heavy equipment, artillery, anti-tank guns, jeeps, medical supplies that parachute drops could not deliver. They would be preceded by carpet bombing and fighter sweeps to suppress anti-aircraft defenses. They would be supported by immediate resupply drops and, crucially, by ground forces advancing to link up with airborne units within hours or days of the initial landing. This integrated approach addressed the very vulnerabilities that had made Crete so costly for German forces. German paratroopers at Crete had been lightly armed and isolated, forced to seize equipment from the enemy or wait for resupply by air. Allied airborne troops would land with organic artillery support, anti-tank weapons, and the mobility provided by jeeps. German gliders at Crete had landed piecemeal, their crews often unable to coordinate with other units. Allied gliders would land in coordinated serials with designated assembly points and pre-planned objectives. German paratroopers at Crete had lacked air support once on the ground. The Luftwaffe's fighters pulled away to other operations. Allied airborne troops would operate under an umbrella of air superiority so complete that Luftwaffe interference was negligible. But in the spring of 1944, German intelligence did not fully grasp this doctrinal revolution. They saw the components, the gliders, the paratroopers, the training exercises, but failed to synthesize them into a complete picture of Allied capability. This failure of imagination, combined with institutional bias and material constraints, left German defenders psychologically and tactically unprepared for what was about to happen. Klaus Dietrich, crouched in his hedgerow position on the morning of June 6th, was the inheritor of all these miscalculations. He had been told that gliders were fragile and ineffective. He had been briefed that any airborne operations would be small-scale and diversionary. He had been assured that the Allies lacked the capability for sustained operations behind German lines. And now, as the sky filled with descending gliders, and the distinctive crack of British Sten guns echoed across the Norman fields, he was learning that everything he had been told was wrong. The second glider's troops reached the hedgerow within 3 minutes of landing. Dietrich fired a burst from his MG-42, the gun's savage rate of fire tearing through the early morning air. But the British troops, he could see their distinctive helmets now, had already taken cover in the irrigation ditch running parallel to the field. One of them had a Payat anti-tank weapon, its distinctive silhouette unmistakable even in the poor light. Another was setting up a Bren light machine gun, movements calm and practiced despite the incoming fire. These were not disorganized survivors of a crash. They were combat troops executing a rehearsed plan, and they had brought their weapons with them intact. Werner Stolz, feeding the belt into the MG-42, was swearing continuously under his breath. Where are they all coming from? Where is the Luftwaffe? Why aren't they being shot down? His voice had an edge of panic that Dietrich had never heard before. Not in 2 years fighting on the Eastern Front, not during the brutal defensive battles in Italy. The panic was contagious because it was rational. Both men were realizing, in that moment, that the tactical situation they had prepared for no longer existed. Behind them they could hear Lieutenant Schaefer shouting orders, trying to organize a withdrawal to the secondary defensive line 800 meters to the east. But more gliders were landing between their current position and that fallback line, and the sound of small arms fire was already coming from that direction. The British, or were some of them Americans? Dietrich couldn't tell in the chaos. Were not scattered across the countryside waiting to be rounded up. They were seizing road junctions, bridges, and crossroads, with a coordination that suggested detailed planning and precise navigation. Navigation. That was another thing the briefings had gotten wrong. Dietrich had been told that gliders would be scattered across kilometers of countryside, their pilots unable to navigate precisely in darkness or under fire. But the gliders around him had landed in loose but definite patterns, concentrated around what he now recognized as tactically significant terrain. The massive Horsa glider that had come down in the field to his north had landed less than 50 meters from the small stone bridge over the Caen Canal tributary. The Waco gliders flanking it had formed a rough perimeter around the bridge approach. This was not random. This was not the confused shambles he had expected. The realization brought a cold clarity that was worse than panic. If the enemy could navigate this precisely, if they could land this much combat power behind German lines, if they could do it under fire and in darkness,
then the intelligence briefings had been worse than wrong. They had been catastrophically, perhaps deliberately, misleading. Either German intelligence had failed completely to assess Allied capability, or, and this thought was more disturbing, the Allied capability had grown so dramatically in recent months that previous assessments were simply obsolete. Both possibilities led to the same conclusion. The German army in France was fighting an enemy whose capabilities it did not understand and could not match. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The sun was rising now, pale light spreading across the Norman countryside, and with the light came full comprehension of the scale of the assault. Dietrich, still trying to suppress the British troops in the irrigation ditch, took a moment to look east toward the coast. The sky was full of aircraft. Not dozens, hundreds. Transport planes in long streams, gliders in tow, still approaching the landing zones. Fighter aircraft circling above them, their distinctive silhouettes marking them as American Thunderbolts and British Typhoons. And beyond them, just visible in the morning haze, the dark specks of bombers heading inland. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. This absence was perhaps the most psychologically devastating element of the entire morning. Dietrich had fought in the east, where Luftwaffe support was limited but at least present. He had heard stories from North Africa where the Allies had enjoyed air superiority, but German fighters still contested the skies. This was different. This was not air superiority, but air supremacy, so total that the enemy could conduct massive daylight operations without meaningful interference. The Allies had not just brought gliders. They had brought an entire airborne army, and they had done so under an umbrella of air power that made German defensive doctrine, built around the assumption of at least contested skies, completely obsolete. The tactical implications were immediate and dire. Without air support, German mobile reserves could not move during daylight hours. Without air reconnaissance, German commanders could not assess the full scope of the Allied landings. Without air superiority, German defensive positions could be suppressed by Allied fighter bombers at will. The gliders, which German intelligence had dismissed as vulnerable and primitive, were operating in an environment where their vulnerabilities did not matter, because German forces lacked the means to exploit them. Lieutenant Schaefer made the decision around 0600 hours. They would withdraw, abandoning the forward positions and attempting to reach the rally point at the crossroads 3 kilometers south. The alternative was to be surrounded and destroyed piecemeal by the Allied troops who were now landing in their rear areas. It was the right decision tactically, but it meant abandoning prepared positions, giving up ground, and acknowledging that the defensive plan had failed in its first hours. The withdrawal was a nightmare. British troops from the landed gliders had seized the obvious routes of retreat, forcing Dietrich's squad to move cross-country through the hedgerows. Twice they encountered other glider-landed units and had to fight brief, vicious skirmishes to break contact. Stolz was wounded in the second encounter. A Bren gun burst, catching him in the shoulder. They left him at a farm with other wounded, knowing that he would likely be captured within hours. By mid-morning, Dietrich's squad, now down to 6 effectives from the original 12, had reached a defensive position held by elements of the 716th Infantry Division. The troops there were in similar condition, shaken and disorganized, many wounded, all telling variations of the same story. Gliders had landed everywhere. The British had seized bridges, road junctions, and artillery positions. American paratroopers, the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, they would learn later, had landed further inland and were raising havoc in the rear areas. The entire defensive system designed to contain an amphibious landing was being unraveled from behind. A Feldwebel from a pioneer unit was distributing ammunition and trying to organize stragglers into coherent squads. He was older, perhaps 40, and had the weathered look of a veteran from the Eastern Front. Dietrich asked him if he had known the gliders would be like this, if anyone had warned them. The Feldwebel gave him a long look. "We were told they were Holzkisten," he said quietly. "We were told they would crash or scatter. We were told the Allies were desperate." He gestured toward the sky, where another stream of gliders was descending toward landing zones further south. "Does that look like desperation to you?" It did not. It looked like industrial war waged with a competence and material abundance that Germany could no longer match. The scale of Allied glider operations on D-Day was unprecedented in military history, and the statistics bear out why German defenders found the experience so psychologically devastating. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed approximately 13,000 troops by glider in Normandy. This figure includes both the British 6th Airborne Division operations east of the Orne River and the American glider troops of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions landing west of Utah Beach. These troops were delivered by more than 800 gliders in multiple waves beginning in the pre-dawn hours and continuing throughout the day. The British operations alone involved over 300 gliders, primarily the airspeed Horsa, but including several massive Hamilcar gliders capable of carrying light tanks. These gliders delivered not just infantry, but complete combat teams with organic artillery, anti-tank weapons, engineers, and medical support. The famous Coup de Main operation that seized Pegasus Bridge and Horsa Bridge involved just 6 gliders landing within meters of their objectives in darkness, their troops securing both bridges within 15 minutes of landing. This precision was not luck, but the result of intensive training and sophisticated navigation techniques that German intelligence had failed to predict. American glider operations were equally impressive in scale if less precise in execution. The 82nd Airborne used Waco CG-4A gliders to deliver artillery batteries, anti-tank guns, and additional infantry to reinforce the paratrooper drops scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula. The 101st Airborne's glider echelon brought in desperately needed anti-tank weapons and ammunition that proved crucial in defending against German counterattacks around Carentan. While many American gliders were indeed scattered or damaged in landing, the bocage country of Normandy was far from ideal glider terrain. The overall operational effect was exactly what German intelligence had said was impossible: the rapid delivery of heavy equipment and organized units behind defensive lines. The casualty figures tell a complex story that contradicts the German assumption that gliders were essentially suicide missions. British glider troops on D-Day suffered approximately 8% casualties in the first 24 hours, including landing accidents and combat losses. This was significant but far lower than the catastrophic losses German planners had predicted. American glider casualties were higher, around 15% in the initial operations, but many of these occurred during subsequent combat operations rather than in the landings themselves. Compare this to German paratrooper losses at Crete, over 25% casualties in the first 3 days, and the effectiveness of Allied glider doctrine becomes clear. More than the numbers, what shocked German defenders was the capability those numbers represented. The Allies had not just built thousands of gliders. They had created an entire operational ecosystem around glider warfare. They had trained specialized glider pilots, developed procedures for mass formation flying, created doctrine for rapid assembly after landing, and integrated glider operations seamlessly into larger combined arms plans. This level of organizational sophistication suggested
an approach to warfare that was qualitatively different from what German forces were accustomed to facing. The reports filtering back to German high command in the days following D-Day reflect the shock of this recognition. A 7th Army intelligence summary from June 8th, captured by Allied forces after the war, noted that enemy airborne operations exceeded all expectations in scale and effectiveness, and recommended immediate revision of defensive doctrine regarding airborne threats. A report from the 716th Infantry Division described glider landings as accurate and concentrated despite darkness and defensive fire, and noted that previous intelligence assessments vastly underestimated enemy capability. These reports had little immediate impact on the broader strategic situation. By June 8th, the Normandy beachhead was secure, and the outcome of the invasion was no longer in serious doubt. But they represented an intellectual reckoning within the German military establishment. The comfortable assumptions about Allied tactical incompetence, the dismissal of enemy innovations as desperate improvisations, the projection of German limitations onto enemy capabilities, all of this had been proven catastrophically wrong in a single day. For individual German soldiers like Klaus Dietrich, the psychological impact was more immediate and personal. The world made sense when your enemy was materially superior but tactically predictable, when you could rely on better training and experience to offset disadvantages in equipment and numbers. The world became incomprehensible when your enemy demonstrated not just material superiority, but tactical and operational innovation beyond your own capabilities. Dietrich survived D-Day and the subsequent Battle of Normandy, fighting in a series of increasingly desperate defensive actions as the Allied beachhead expanded. His personal diary, recovered from a German prisoner of war camp in England and now held in the Imperial War Museum, contains an entry from June 10th that captures the disillusionment of that period. We were told so many things. The Allies cannot fight at night. The Allies cannot coordinate complex operations. The Allies waste their materiel through incompetence. All lies, or perhaps truths that are no longer true. The soldiers who came from the sky in their wooden gliders fought as well as any unit I faced in Russia, and they came with more equipment than we have seen in months. When I think of what we were told about them, that they were flying to their deaths in coffins, I feel not anger but a kind of despair. If we were wrong about this, what else are we wrong about? And if we cannot trust what we are told, how can we fight? This sense of epistemic collapse, the breakdown of trust in institutional knowledge and command authority, was perhaps as damaging to German morale as the material losses of the Normandy campaign. Soldiers could accept defeat in battle, could adapt to material disadvantages, could even endure horrific casualties if they believed their sacrifice served a comprehensible strategic purpose. But when the basic framework of understanding collapsed, when the intelligence briefings and tactical assessments proved so comprehensively wrong, the psychological foundation for continued resistance eroded. The German High Command's response to this crisis of understanding was telling. Rather than fundamentally reassessing Allied capabilities, many senior officers retreated into conspiracy thinking or fatalism. The success of Allied airborne operations was attributed to lucky conditions, to massive but unsustainable material expenditure, to tactical factors specific to Normandy that would not apply elsewhere. The alternative, that the Allies had developed a form of warfare that Germany could not match, was too threatening to the institutional identity of the Wehrmacht to be fully acknowledged. This denial would have consequences beyond Normandy. When the Allies launched Operation Market Garden in September of 1944, attempting to seize bridges across the Netherlands using another massive airborne operation, German forces were again caught off guard by the scale and sophistication of the assault. Despite having 4 months to absorb the lessons of D-Day,
despite having intelligence reports documenting Allied airborne capability in detail. The German defenders in Holland were surprised by the size of the operation and the capability of the forces they faced. Market Garden ultimately failed in its strategic objectives. The bridge at Arnhem proved one bridge too far, but not because of glider vulnerability or Allied tactical incompetence. It failed because of flawed intelligence on German force dispositions, bad weather that disrupted resupply operations, and the difficulty of coordinating airborne and ground operations across a narrow salient. But the airborne assault itself, including massive glider operations that delivered entire battalions with their equipment intact, again demonstrated a level of operational capability that exceeded German expectations. The performance of Allied gliders in Market Garden was actually better than on D-Day in many respects. Landing zones in Holland were more open, navigation was more precise, and casualty rates among glider troops were lower despite landing in daylight under fire. British Horsa and Hamilcar gliders delivered Bren carriers, anti-tank guns, and even light tanks to troops fighting around Arnhem and Nijmegen. American Waco gliders brought artillery and supplies to the 101st Airborne holding the corridor around Eindhoven. The glider operations worked largely as planned. It was the ground link-up that failed, not the airborne assault itself. Yet German after-action reports from Market Garden continued to express surprise at Allied glider capability. A report from Dessernes SS Panzer Corps, which led the defense around Arnhem, noted that British glider troops were well-equipped and organized, and that their gliders delivered heavy equipment, including anti-tank weapons that complicated our counterattacks. The fact that this was still being noted as surprising 4 months after D-Day and after multiple smaller Allied airborne operations in Italy and southern France suggests the depth of German institutional resistance to updating their assessments of enemy capability. This resistance was not entirely irrational. Acknowledging the full extent of Allied superiority in airborne warfare meant acknowledging broader truths about the strategic situation that many German officers were not prepared to accept. If the Allies could deliver division-strength forces behind German lines with precision and support them with overwhelming air power, if they could produce gliders and train pilots faster than Germany could deploy defensive forces, if they could integrate airborne operations into complex combined arms campaigns with a sophistication that exceeded German capabilities, then the war was not merely difficult but unwinnable. Some German officers reached this conclusion in the summer and fall of 1944. The diary entries, post-war memoirs, and private correspondence of mid-level officers from this period show an increasing sense of fatalism, a recognition that they were fighting an enemy with resources and organizational capability that could not be matched. But this recognition was dangerous to express openly, and many officers who understood the situation privately continued to maintain the fiction of eventual German victory in official communications and public statements. The broader impact of Allied glider operations on the Western Front extended beyond individual battles. The mere threat of airborne assault forced German commanders to disperse defensive forces, garrison potential landing zones, and maintain mobile reserves that might otherwise have been committed to frontline defense. Every open field in occupied territory was a potential glider landing zone. Every bridge, crossroads, and communications hub was a potential airborne objective. This created a defensive problem that stretched German resources even further. After D-Day, German forces throughout France and the Low Countries began installing obstacles in potential landing zones. The Rommel's asparagus, that had been an afterthought before the invasion became a priority afterward. Thousands of poles, ditches, and wire obstacles were emplaced in fields across Western Europe. This effort consumed labor and materials that were desperately needed for other defensive preparations, and it never achieved its intended effect. The obstacles made glider landings more dangerous but not impossible, and Allied air superiority meant that German forces rarely had advance warning of where glider operations would occur anyway. The psychological impact on German rear area troops was significant. Supply convoys, communications centers, and headquarters units, elements that had previously felt relatively secure behind the front lines, now had to consider the possibility of airborne assault. This did not paralyze German operations, but it added another layer of stress and uncertainty to an already overstretched military machine. Guards had to be posted, defensive positions prepared, contingency plans maintained. All of this consumed time and effort that reduced overall military efficiency. There was also a propaganda dimension to the Allied glider operations that affected German morale beyond the immediate tactical impact. The image of massive formations of gliders and transport aircraft filling the sky, operating without meaningful German interference, was a powerful visual demonstration of Allied material superiority. German soldiers who witnessed these operations or heard about them from comrades could not miss the implication. The enemy had so many aircraft, so much production capacity, that they could afford to use thousands of gliders in single operations. This contrasted sharply with the German experience, where every aircraft was precious, fuel was scarce, and Luftwaffe support was increasingly rare. German propaganda attempted to counter this impression by emphasizing Allied casualties and the alleged wastefulness of glider operations. But these messages rang hollow to soldiers who had actually faced Allied airborne troops. The troops coming out of those supposedly suicidal gliders were well-equipped, well-trained, and combat effective. The gliders themselves, while certainly vulnerable, were delivering their cargoes with sufficient reliability to make the operations worthwhile. Propaganda could not erase what soldiers had seen with their own eyes. Klaus Dietrich was captured by American forces in late July of 1944 near St. Lo, after his unit was surrounded during the breakout from the Normandy hedgerows. His interrogation report, filed with U.S. Army intelligence and declassified in the 1970s, provides insight into how one German soldier processed the experience of facing Allied glider operations. Asked about German intelligence assessments of Allied airborne capability, Dietrich reportedly laughed bitterly. "We were told they were flying coffins," he said. "We were told the enemy was desperate. Then we saw hundreds of them landing in our rear areas, and the troops inside fought like devils. Either our intelligence was incompetent or they were lying to us. I don't know which is worse." The interrogator noted that Dietrich seemed less concerned with the tactical details of specific engagements than with the broader implications of German intelligence failures. When asked whether he believed Germany could still win the war, Dietrich hesitated before answering. "If we were this wrong about the gliders, what else are we wrong about?" he said. "How can you win a war when you don't understand your enemy?" This question captures something essential about the German experience in the final year of the war. The Wehrmacht had entered the conflict with confidence in its tactical and operational superiority, its doctrine forged in the victories of 1939 through 1942. But by 1944, that doctrine was increasingly obsolete, and the institution was proving unable to adapt quickly enough to the changing nature of the war. Allied innovations in airborne warfare were just one example of this adaptation gap, but they were a particularly visible and psychologically impactful example. The gliders that German intelligence had dismissed as primitive and suicidal were, in reality, the product of a sophisticated military-industrial system that could identify operational requirements, design solutions, mass-produce the necessary equipment, and train personnel to use it effectively, all within a time frame of 2 to 3 years. This cycle of innovation and production was something the German military-industrial complex, strained by years of total war and strategic bombing, could no longer match. By the winter of 1944 to 45, as Allied forces closed in on Germany from both east and west, the question of glider vulnerability had become moot. The war was lost, and not because of any single weapon or tactical innovation, but because of the cumulative weight of Allied material, organizational, and industrial superiority. The gliders were just one manifestation of that superiority, one example among many of how the Allies had developed capabilities that the Wehrmacht could not counter. But for the German soldiers who had faced those gliders on D-Day, in Market Garden, in the scattered airborne operations throughout the campaign in Northwest Europe, they remained a powerful symbol of how wrong things had gone. They had been told to expect suicide missions and found instead combat-effective troops delivered by a logistics system that functioned despite its apparent vulnerability. They had been told to expect scattered, disorganized landings and found instead coordinated operations executed with precision. They had been told to expect Allied desperation and found instead Allied confidence backed by industrial might. The gliders exposed the gap between German expectations and Allied reality, and that gap was impossible to ignore or explain away. In the hedgerows of Normandy, in the polders of Holland, in the forests of the Ardennes, German soldiers looked up and saw the sky full of wooden aircraft carrying enemy troops, and they understood in that moment that the war they thought they were fighting was not the war that was actually happening. That realization, that moment of cognitive dissonance when ideology collides with undeniable material fact, is perhaps the most enduring psychological legacy of Allied glider operations. It was not just a tactical defeat, but an epistemological one, a shattering of the framework through which German soldiers understood the conflict. And once that framework was shattered, it was very difficult to put back together. In the aftermath of the war, as historians began analyzing German intelligence failures and doctrinal rigidity, the question of why German assessments of Allied glider capability were so wrong became a subject of significant study. The explanations are complex and multifaceted, but they reveal something important about how militaries can fail to understand their adversaries even when the evidence is available. Part of the failure was structural. German intelligence in the later years of the war was fragmented across multiple competing agencies: the Abwehr, the SD, Luftwaffe intelligence, Army intelligence, each with different methodologies and institutional biases. Information was often compartmentalized, making it difficult to synthesize intelligence from multiple sources into a coherent assessment. Reports about Allied glider production might be filed by one agency, reports about training by another, and technical assessments of glider capabilities by a third, with no mechanism for integrating these separate pieces into a comprehensive picture. Part of the failure was cognitive. Intelligence analysts, like all humans, interpret new information through existing frameworks of understanding. When those frameworks are deeply ingrained through institutional culture and personal experience, contradictory information is often dismissed or explained away rather than accepted. German intelligence officers who had internalized the lessons of Crete, that gliders were vulnerable, and large-scale airborne operations were prohibitively costly, found it difficult to accept evidence that the Allies had developed solutions to these problems. Part of the failure was material. By 1944, German intelligence resources were stretched thin. Aerial reconnaissance over Britain was virtually impossible due to Allied air defenses. Agent networks in the United States and United Kingdom had been largely rolled up or turned. Much of German intelligence about Allied capabilities was based on captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and signals intelligence, none of which provided a complete picture of Allied industrial capacity or training programs. German analysts were often working with fragmentary information and filling in the gaps with assumptions based on their own experience. But perhaps the most significant factor was psychological resistance rooted in strategic despair. By early 1944, many German officers understood at some level that the war was likely lost. The Eastern Front was in retreat, Italy had surrendered, and the Allied bombing campaign was devastating German cities and industry. Accepting that the Allies had also achieved operational and tactical superiority in areas like airborne warfare, areas where Germany had once been the innovator, meant accepting the totality of German
defeat. It was psychologically easier to dismiss Allied gliders as inferior copies of German innovations, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. This psychological factor helps explain why German assessments of Allied glider capability did not significantly improve even after D-Day provided overwhelming evidence of their effectiveness. Institutional inertia, combined with a kind of defensive pessimism that refused to acknowledge the full extent of Allied superiority, meant that many German officers continued to underestimate Allied airborne capability, even as they were being defeated by it. The post-war writings of German officers reflect this psychological complexity. Many memoirs from the 1950s and 60s acknowledge that German intelligence underestimated Allied capabilities, but they often frame this as the result of specific failures, bad intelligence reports, inadequate reconnaissance, rather than as a systemic institutional failure to adapt to a changing military reality. There is often an undercurrent of defensiveness, a need to explain defeat in terms that preserve the reputation of German military professionalism. Friedrich von der Heydte's memoir, published in German in 1958, is unusually honest about the intelligence failures regarding gliders. He wrote, "We failed to understand that the Allies were not simply replicating our airborne doctrine with greater resources. They were creating something fundamentally new, an integrated system of airborne warfare that was qualitatively different from our own approach. Our intelligence officers, including myself, projected our own limitations onto the enemy and paid the price for that projection." This recognition that the failure was one of imagination as much as information cuts to the heart of the matter. German intelligence had the data to understand Allied glider capability. Reports about production numbers, training programs, and doctrinal development were available, often from reliable sources. What was lacking was the conceptual flexibility to synthesize that information into an accurate assessment that contradicted established doctrine and comfortable assumptions. The Allied glider operations of 1944 thus serve as a case study in intelligence failure, but one with broader implications than simply getting the facts wrong. They demonstrate how institutional culture, cognitive biases, and psychological defense mechanisms can prevent organizations from adapting to changing circumstances even when the need for adaptation is obvious. They show how victories in the past can become obstacles to understanding the present, as successful doctrine hardens into dogma that resists evidence of its obsolescence. For Klaus Dietrich and the thousands of other German soldiers who faced Allied gliders in combat, these analytical failures translated into tactical disasters and personal tragedies. They were sent into battle with inaccurate assessments of enemy capability, armed with doctrine that no longer matched reality, fighting a war that their own leadership did not fully understand. The fact that they fought with skill and courage despite these handicaps speaks to their professionalism as soldiers. The fact that they lost speaks to the impossibility of overcoming the systemic failures of the institution they served. In the decades after the war, Allied glider operations faded somewhat from popular memory, overshadowed by more dramatic elements of the D-Day narrative. The beach landings, the paratrooper drops, the individual acts of heroism. The gliders themselves, most of them destroyed or scrapped shortly after their use, left few physical traces.
Only a handful survive in museums, their wooden frames fragile testaments to a brief but significant chapter in military history. But for military historians and theorists, Allied glider operations remain a subject of enduring interest precisely because they represent such a clear example of operational innovation in wartime. The Allies identified a capability gap, the inability to deliver heavy equipment by parachute, and developed a solution that integrated existing technologies in novel ways. They then scaled that solution to operational relevance through industrial production and systematic training, all within a compressed time frame driven by strategic necessity. This process of identify, develop, scale, deploy is recognizable to modern military planners as the basic cycle of military innovation, but executing it successfully in wartime, under pressure, against a determined enemy, is extraordinarily difficult. The fact that the Allies succeeded where others had failed or never attempted speaks to the organizational and industrial strengths that ultimately determined the outcome of the war. It also speaks to the importance of accurate intelligence and the willingness to update assessments based on new evidence. The German failure to understand Allied glider capability was not inevitable. With better intelligence collection, more flexible analytical frameworks, and greater institutional willingness to challenge established doctrine, German forces could have prepared more effectively for airborne operations. They still would have faced overwhelming Allied material superiority, but they might have avoided the psychological shock and tactical disarray that characterized the German response to D-Day. The lesson, to the extent that historical examples provide lessons, is that military organizations must balance doctrinal consistency with adaptive flexibility, must value intelligence that contradicts comfortable assumptions as highly as intelligence that confirms them, and must maintain the intellectual humility to recognize when the enemy has evolved beyond your understanding of their capabilities. These are difficult standards to meet in peacetime, let alone in the midst of existential conflict, when resources are scarce and strategic options are narrowing. The German failure to meet them in 1944 is understandable in human terms, even as it was catastrophic in military terms. It is easy in retrospect to see where intelligence assessments were wrong, where doctrine should have been updated, where psychological barriers prevented accurate understanding. It is much harder to do so in real time, under pressure, with incomplete information and institutional resistance. But the consequences of failure were stark. On June 6, 1944, thousands of Allied troops landed behind German lines in fragile wooden aircraft that German intelligence had dismissed as suicide missions. They landed largely intact, largely on target, and they accomplished their objectives with a competence that shattered German assumptions about Allied capability. In doing so, they helped secure the beachhead that would eventually doom the Third Reich. Klaus Dietrich survived the war and returned to Germany in 1948 after 4 years as a prisoner of war in England and then in the United States. His post-war life, documented in letters held by his family, was marked by what appears to have been a profound disillusionment with authority and official narratives. He rarely spoke about his war experiences except to emphasize how much he and his comrades had been lied to, how little they had truly understood about the war they were fighting. In a letter to a fellow veteran in 1953, he wrote about the morning of D-Day and the gliders landing in the Norman fields. I remember thinking, as I watched them come down, that everything I had been told was wrong. Not just wrong about the gliders, but wrong about everything. The enemy's weakness, our inevitable victory, the justice of our cause. All of it was lies, or maybe truths that had stopped being true. The gliders did not lie. They came down full of soldiers who fought better than we did, with equipment we no longer had, supported by an air force we could not match. That was the truth, and once you saw it, you could not unsee it. This recognition that the gliders forced a reckoning with reality that propaganda could not deflect may be their most significant legacy. They were weapons, yes, and effective ones, but they were also evidence, undeniable and material, of the true balance of power in the war. For German soldiers who had been raised on narratives of superiority and inevitable victory, that evidence was devastating in ways that went beyond tactical defeat. The gliders exposed not just the intelligence failure, but a deeper crisis of understanding, a gap between what German soldiers had been told about the war and what the war actually was. In the space of a single morning, thousands of German defenders learned that the enemy they faced was more capable, more organized, and more powerful than they had been prepared to believe. And once that lesson was learned, it could not be unlearned. The wooden crates that fell from the sky over Normandy carried more than soldiers and equipment. They carried the weight of Allied industrial might, the sophistication of Allied tactical innovation, and the undeniable evidence that the war Germany thought it was fighting had ended, if it had ever really existed at all. What remained was the grim task of fighting a war that was already lost, against an enemy that Germany no longer understood and could not defeat. That, perhaps, is the true story of the gliders. Not just what they accomplished tactically, but what they revealed strategically about the nature of the conflict and the inevitability of its outcome. They were instruments of war, but also instruments of revelation, forcing German soldiers and commanders to confront truths they had been avoiding or denying. And in warfare, as in life, the moment of confronting undeniable truth can be the most devastating moment of all. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.